And of course, as many people in this room know, we've been fighting about it ever since. But the Guilds of London outlined the structure of, the economic structure of the Ulster plantation, what is now called Northern Ireland. And they brought in a very heavy percentage of Scottish farmers, yeoman farmers, and soldiers to build the defensive structure, as it were, in more than a century, now more than 3 centuries, of conflict. And this conflict in north of Ireland was not really Protestant versus Catholic. It was that, but it was much different when it came to the Protestant side. We had the Anglican English, who were the controlling structure of the government, and then you had the Scottish Presbyterians, who in many cases now became, once they came here, became the Bible Belt, the Baptists, the fundamentalist Christians in this country. And after the siege of Londonderry in 1689, and then the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, the Ulster Scots took a look around and they said, you know, we don't fit very well in either side of this. They had become known as the first political nonconformists. They had developed a philosophy politically and morally that no individual had an obligation to obey their government if the government was asking them to do something that conflicted with their religious beliefs and their moral principles. So they started leaving the north of Ireland. The first group that left the north of Ireland was heavily from the town of Londonderry, or if you are Irish Catholic, now Derry. They were Calvinists. They believed that the Calvinists who had settled in Massachusetts would welcome them with open arms. So the first big shipload that came from Northern Ireland went into Massachusetts, and they found something that surprised them, and that was that the English derivative Calvinists did not like them very much. They were writing constantly about these Irish, they wear their clothes differently, they like to drink, they are pretty wild. And so they left from Massachusetts and came into New Hampshire and founded the town of Londonderry. 95% of the rest of this migration, which continued from 1717 until the beginning of the American Revolution, settled along the Appalachian Mountains in the American South, which is where almost all of my family originated. After the lack of a welcome up here, the rest of the migration went down through what they call the Great Wagon Road, starting in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then moving through the mountains all the way down into northern Georgia and northern Alabama. So when I look up at New Hampshire and I see, you know, don't tread on me, or, you know, live free or die. And in fact, I don't know if it's still true, but I think New Hampshire had the only NASCAR track in this part of America. I kind of get a feeling like there's a long time connection here with the philosophy, the independent philosophy that people here have, and the philosophy in which I was raised in, that came out of the Appalachian Mountains and the Mountain South. I want to say something else about memoirs. This book is what is best called an early years memoir. And when I left the Senate, there were a lot of my colleagues that were saying, "Oh, Webb, we know what you're going to do. You've been sitting in these closed door meetings for 6 years. You've been listening to the caucus debates, et cetera. You're going to go write the great tell-all book." And I just said, I just don't believe in that. I spent 4 years as an Assistant Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Navy meeting with Secretary of Defense Weinberger every day, and you will never see a word that was said when the door was closed and policy decisions were being discussed. I think for government to operate in a healthy way, the leaders shouldn't have to be looking over their shoulders and wondering what exact notes people are taking when it's supposed to be a private meeting and when you're supposed to be openly debating how to solve problems. So I decided, rather than writing a book about my time in government, I would like to sort of write one about what shaped me as a young person. How do you become who you are? Probably is the best way to say that. What are the things that impact you through your family, through the challenges that you have, the respect that you learn for the sacrifices of those who went before you? What are all of these things together? How do they make you who you are? And so I decided that I would write from the time that I was born, living with, in many cases, just with my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt when my father was constantly deployed. The struggles that we had, the respect that we learned for service to country through what my father went through. And then all the way through to the Naval Academy, my time in the Naval Academy, and my time in Vietnam. And then just a brief final chapter talking about the concerns that I have in our country today and what I think people need to do in terms of stepping up and making things fair in a way that we've always believed America should be fair. So that was the book, and I mentioned my dad and my grandmother. My dad was the first one in our family in 9 generations of Webbs to finish high school. Our family had settled in the Appalachian Mountains, and it was a place where there was no infrastructure. There were no towns. It became even more remote as the centuries moved forward, and a lot of it was bypassed. He also went to night school for 26 years and graduated from college my senior year in high school. And I have to say that was one of the most powerful moments of my life, to have watched him piece together constant deployments in the military and balancing moves and being a father, and then always wanting to get that degree. It's what it meant to him. And he graduated from the University of Omaha, which is now University of Nebraska at Omaha, my senior year. And I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the book or the movie The Great Santini. For those of you who haven't, it's a great story, but it's about a career pilot and a relationship with his kids and this sort of stuff. And my dad, when he walked up to get the diploma, we were in the boys' gym of the University of Omaha. It was a basketball court. The bleachers were pulled out, and we're sitting there, and I'm sitting in the front row, and he's walking through the line with all these young folks, and got his diploma and broke out of line and walked across the basketball court right toward me. And I call that my great Santini moment. I went, oh no, he's not really going to do this, but he did. He walked up and stuck the diploma in my face. And he said, you can get anything you want in this country, and don't you ever forget it. My mother is from East Arkansas. Her father was a tenant farmer in East Arkansas. And when I was having to take the vote on health care reform, that was a hard vote. I want to say that because there were a lot of things in that bill that I didn't think needed to be in the bill. I voted with the Republicans 18 times on different amendments on the bill. But when it came to final passage, I just had to stop and think about the journey that my mom's family went through. She was one of 8 kids, and 3 of them died in childhood of diseases we don't even talk about anymore. Not childbirth, childhood. Her father died when she was 10 because there was no doctor. And if you look back in that time period, in the 1930s, in the early 1940s, when programs like Social Security were being put online, and later on Medicare. Every time you have a program that's going to help people who don't have anything, there's always this big debate: are we turning into a socialist system, or are we giving people something they don't deserve? And that really was the image that was in my mind when I said, all right, we've got to change the health care programs in this country. And by the way, we got to keep fixing them, because I don't think this bill is one that, or this piece of legislation is one that should stand the way that it is. But as opposed to doing nothing, this was what my conscience told me that I had to do. And growing up in the military, back then, there were no family programs. You know, one of the great satisfactions of my professional career is that I've been involved in the military all my life. I grew up in it. I served in it. I've served as a journalist in different places. In addition to Beirut, I was a embed in Afghanistan. I worked on the Veterans Committee for 4 years. I spent 5 years in the Pentagon, and nothing has made me happier when I look at the military than the way that family programs have evolved from the time that I was a kid. You know, we had a period when my dad went back into the military after World War II, where he was deployed for 3.5 years, either overseas or in bases that had no family housing. At one point, he was stationed at Scott Air Force Base, Illinois, and we were living in St. Joseph, Missouri, and he would drive 380 miles one way every weekend. He'd get off work at 5 or around 5, and he'd drive all night. No interstate. Drive all night, show up early Saturday morning, raise hell with us for a day and a half, get back in the car, drive 380 miles back. And during those periods, you know, my mother was 24 years old with 4 kids. And if my grandmother hadn't been able to move in with us, I don't know what we would have done. There was no family assistance programs. There was nothing that the families could fall back on when you're out like that. And you look at the systems we have in place today, and you know, they're good, they're solid. The schools are good, the family support programs are good, and that's good for us as a country. I got to the Naval Academy. Actually, I graduated in 1968. I got to the Naval Academy in 1964, and during that 4-year period when I was a midshipman, our country went through some incredible turmoil, just incredible turmoil. Those of you who remember that time period, I know you have strong memories. So 1 week after I reported to the Naval Academy, the Civil Rights Act was signed, when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. About 6 weeks after I reported to the Naval Academy, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, which began our heavier involvement in the Vietnam War. In that next 4 years, we saw riots on the street. The civil rights movement, in many cases, turned violent. We saw the war in Vietnam increase into its peak period. And just in the few months before I graduated from the Naval Academy, we saw Martin Luther King assassinated in April. We saw the Tet Offensive, the peak of the Vietnam War, occurring in February. In fact, I don't think there was anybody in my class at the Naval Academy who had not lost a good friend by the time we graduated. The night before we graduated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. We saw that summer the confrontations of the Democratic National Convention. And then those of us who had gone to the Naval Academy, particularly those of us who went in the Marine Corps, we all know where we were going. The Marine Corps lost 100,000 killed or wounded in the Vietnam War. That went right over the heads of a lot of people in this country as the war was debated, and in many ways unfairly, I believe. But the Marine Corps in Vietnam lost 3 times as many killed in action as it did in Korea. It lost more total killed and wounded than in World War II. There were more killed in World War II, but there were more wounded in Vietnam for the Marine Corps. In the year that I was in Vietnam, 1969, was the second worst year of the war. 1968 was the worst year of the war. 1967 was about the same, but that 3-year period, if you look at the bell curve of the casualties and the fights in Vietnam, those were the 3 most difficult years. And at the same time, by 1969, the country had started to question the nature of the war. So we're in this period. This is a period of Hamburger Hill, for those of you who are younger might remember, at least the film about. We knew that things weren't going well domestically at home, but it did not affect the performance of the people who were on the battlefield. And that's the contributions that those people made, I don't think have ever been fully appreciated by our country. I will tell you, they're the finest people I've ever been around, the people that I served with in combat in Vietnam. We lost in 1969 twice as many Americans as have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined in the last 12 years. I lost more than 12,000 killed in Vietnam during that period. And then came the process of returning back to the country, picking up our lives, moving forward, and trying to figure out, what you do after you've been through that. And that's really the trajectory of the book. And I finish it really with the years right after I came back from Vietnam. I'd been wounded, and I was trying to stay in the Marine Corps. And I was put on the Secretary of the Navy staff on a medical hold. And I started writing every day as a part of my job for the first time in my life. And I found that I loved it. I loved how do you really get into the room if you've got ideas and you want to change things, and particularly in the structure, the military structure, where I'm a 25-year-old captain. How do I get heard if I have ideas or I think things need to be changed? And so I was not only writing for my job, I started writing articles for military journals and that sort of thing in my last year. And then when I left the Marine Corps and started at Georgetown Law School, I really found that writing was one of my great passions, and that I loved what Hemingway used to call the chemistry of the written word, when you take different words and put them together and people see things different ways and understand things in different ways. So from that point forward, I've started this 2-track career totally unintentionally, which is sort of what I was saying when I began talking about the fact that I have to step away every now and then. It's like I was born, I think, or trained from the time I was young through my father, who had an enormous impact on me. That had a duty to lead. That we have a duty to try to solve problems in these countries and to set examples and to bring people together and to motivate them. And then on the other hand, there's nothing more exciting than writing something powerful and having people see things and imagine things in different ways. So I'll do one for a while and I'll miss the other, and I'll do the other for a while and I'll miss the other. And so that is how I ended up with the book that I have. And I'll just stop right there. We'll take questions if you like. So. Yes, sir.
In your introductory comments, you talked about the Affordable Care Act, and that you thought it was flawed. And I wonder if you could tell us what you think the worst deficits or characteristics of it are, and how, if it were possible for you to alter it or redesign a healthcare system, how you would do it.
Let me back up and give you a very frank personal view of step by step how that bill became what it is. I believe that, and I was saying actually when I first came to the Senate, when President Bush was president, that we need to reform our medical care system, but the best way to do it would be for an administration to come up with a proposal and for the Congress then to legislate based on the debate and legislate based on the proposal. They did not do that. You know, I think what had happened, quite frankly, is that President Obama had run on a set of issues that seemed to be the important issues, and then when the economy crashed at the end of '08 and going into '09, they weren't the major issues anymore. Rebuilding the economy was a major issue, and at the same time, I think they learned the wrong lesson from Hillary Care. You know, the lesson supposedly from Hillary Care during the Clinton administration was they sent 1,000 pages of proposals over, and they got ripped up, and they went nowhere. So instead, what the administration did was they said, all right, Congress, you come up with a bill, and I'll say whether I like it or not, or I'll work with you on it. But the legislation got turned over to 5 separate congressional committees, 3 in the House and 2 in the Senate. And it bubbled up through these committees. So there were 7,000 pages of often contradictory information inside these different pieces of legislation. So quite frankly, I don't even know how why they call that Obamacare, because it wasn't the administration putting out a set of clearly understandable objectives. If it were mine to do over again, and I was saying this at the time, I actually went into the White House and said it too, the administration would have had something that the country really supported if they had taken 3 or 4 of the major issues. One of them being this idea that if you have a pre-existing condition, you can't get medical care in a subsequent medical program. I have a grandson, young grandson, who has type 1 diabetes, and you know it freezes the parents. That type of program freezes the parents so that they can't even decide on job possibilities, et cetera. So it would have been better. It would have been good if they had taken 3 or 4 major problems, and I'm not going to sit up here and say exactly which ones were the worst or which ones whatever. But if they had done that, I think you would have had bipartisan support, and it would have been a different environment. Either that or set it aside and say now's not the time to do it. That's not what happened. I think probably the most knowing speech during that whole debate was from Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah, when he stood up and he said, Orrin Hatch, have worked with Ted Kennedy on complicated legislation. If you're going to do something that is this broad and lasting, you should be doing it with 70 votes, not on a straight party line vote. So there would have been ways to get there, I believe. I can't sit here and give you a laundry list, but there would have been ways to get there. Because it was not simply the legislation, it was the impact that it had on the credibility of the president's leadership as well. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for coming. My question is, you've been described as a moderate Democrat, someone who's kind of tough on immigration. After serving in Washington and in the Senate, do you feel that political gridlock between the Democrats and Republicans is a real problem? And if you do, what do you think the solution to it is? Thank you.
I believe that it's obviously a problem, and it's gotten to be a worse problem. And I think after the 2010 elections, one thing that we saw, just looking at the Senate as a body, was that the base of both parties moved further to the extreme. And it showed up in the election of many of the candidates, so that on Tuesday afternoons at lunchtime, the Democrats go in one room, the Republicans go in another room. They have lunch. They talk about their agendas. They figure out, what they're going to push and what they're going to not push. And from that period forward, the center in each party caucus had also moved to an extreme, and so it became very difficult to get things done. Can you get things done? Yes. And I want to give you two examples because there are two things that I worked on that I'm very proud of. The first is the GI Bill. When I talk about programs I've worked on with veterans over the years, before I even decided to run for the Senate, when I saw how hard these people were working after 9/11, including my son, who went to Iraq as dropped out of college and went to Iraq as an enlisted Marine, fought in Ramadi, where all this ISIS stuff is going on right now. So they deserve a true GI Bill. The GI Bill that the military had going into the post 9/11 period was based on recruiting incentive, volunteer military, where the service member paid into the program, and then the military would match it, and it was not a generous GI Bill. And I said, all right, why do we call the World War II generation the greatest generation? A, because of their service, but B, because of what they did after their service. And they had the best GI Bill in history. When they came back from World War II, they had all their tuition paid for, all their books bought, all their fees paid for them, and a monthly living stipend. And so my first day in the Senate, I introduced the post 9/11 GI Bill. And this was not an easy lift. It's so logical in retrospect, at least to me it's logical. But I got pushed from people more senior to me saying, why don't you wait your turn here? I've got this one or I've got this one. But this was a scopy GI Bill. It was the whole thing. Plus the Bush administration opposed this bill till the day it passed. But because they believed it was going to pull the bottom out of retention in the military, which it did not. But I introduced the bill. I went to the other side. I got two Republicans, and I got Frank Lautenberg, a Democrat who had served in World War II. So we had John Warner and Chuck Hagel, two Republicans, a World War II veteran, a Vietnam veteran, Frank Lautenberg and myself, World War II Vietnam, and we pushed hard, and we went over and we listened to people, and this was not a committee bill. This was done right out of our office, and in 16 months we got it passed. And it is I think clearly the most comprehensive piece of veterans legislation since World War II, and since it's been passed, more than 1 million post 9/11 veterans have been able to use it, and that's getting on the other side, engaging, finding ways to listen to where other people might see different portions of a piece of legislation, and you can get things done. The second one, it's not quite the happy ending, but it's in a way it is. When I ran for the Senate, one of the things that I started talking about was the need for this country to fix a broken criminal justice system. It's not the kind of an issue that a lot of people wanted to talk about in '06. I was being advised in Virginia, which is second, I think, only to Texas, it used to be, in terms of death penalty and those sorts of things. I had political advisors pulling me aside and saying, "You're committing suicide, saying that there are too many people in prison." And I said, look, this is not even a political issue. It's a leadership issue in this country. When we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the known world's prison population, And I just said, you know, look, we need to take a holistic look at our entire criminal justice system, not just crack versus powder cocaine, which took 6 years to get through the Congress. That's how things can get slowed down. Let's look at the whole system, from point of apprehension to length of sentencing, to what happens when you're in prison, to what a reentry program ought to look like, and let's deal with gangs. You know, this isn't just, you know, there are too many people in there. So some of the people in there shouldn't be in there. And the ones who should be in there, we should get them in there. We held 2.5 years of hearings. I wasn't on the Judiciary Committee. I was on a Joint Economic Committee, which is not a legislative committee, but I went to the chairman and I said, can you let me hold a hearing on the impact of mass incarceration on our society? Can you let me hold a hearing on drugs in America, you know, the whole drug trade? And we started talking to people across the philosophical spectrum on the issue of how can we fix this? How can we really make a contribution? After 2.5 years, I introduced a piece of legislation calling for a national commission, 18 months, $14 million, one helicopter. That's all it would have cost. Get the best minds in America to come together and to examine every one of these points and tell us the best way to approach issues like nonviolent drug offenses, et cetera, just across the board. We got buy-ins, listening, bringing people into the office, you know, 100 different organizations directly into our office. We got buy-ins from across the philosophical spectrum. And then in this period that you were talking about, this was in October 11, we got the bill up on the Senate floor. I had Lindsey Graham as a co-sponsor. I had Orrin Hatch as a co-sponsor. We were endorsed by the National Association of the Chiefs of Police on the one hand and ACLU on the other. And then they decided they would filibuster it. And so we got 57 votes. We needed 60. We got 4 Republicans. And the bill died. But guess what? We brought that issue out of the shadows. This is, to me, this is as much as I think we could have done at the time. But we got it out of the shadows. We got people talking about it. So that last year at the Conservative Political Action Committee conference, now prison reform is one of the 3 top issues for the Republican Party. Rand Paul's running on it. So even though, you know, we didn't succeed in getting this commission, we've got this out where people can be comfortable with talking about it without worrying that they're not going to get reelected. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for your service. Greatly appreciate your service. Person who's read a few of your books, followed your career. Could you comment on the current situation that's going on in Iraq and Syria? As a combat veteran, I'd like to hear your opinion because many of us are deeply concerned. You know, there's a lack of leadership, there's a lack of purpose. We're again sending young men over there. I don't know what the mission is. Love to get a comment from you.
Let me start where you could if there was some place in the last 2,000 years I could start and have the time, I would do it. I mean, the region has been at each other's throats for 2,000 years. When I was Secretary of the Navy, the Iran-Iraq War was going on. Hundreds of thousands of people killed on both sides. And Cap Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, used to say, this is a war between the worst regime in the world and the second worst regime in the world, and I don't know which is which. Basically, define our national interest. And then I think they made a mistake. The Reagan administration made a mistake. After the Iran-Contra revelations, where it was revealed that we had been giving weapons to Iran, trying to get hostages out. I mean, this is, you can get a little bit of reverberations today. We tilted toward Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War. And then we've started, again and again and again, we seem to be making the same type of mistake in this region. And my advice at that time, and it's been consistent ever since, is that you don't achieve your national objectives in that part of the world when you become an occupying power. You don't take out a hornet's nest by sitting on it. And this is, if we're looking at the situation now, to me, it's the end result of two strategic errors, in my view. One was a decision of the Bush administration to invade Iraq, where we set loose the sectarian violence. And then the end result, after all of this bloodshed, was a regime that came in and was predictably pro-Shia, and in the process, through the invasion, we empowered Iran, which is one of the things I was trying to warn about at the time. And you have this tremendous resentment in the Sunni sections of Iraq. The second mistake was the way that this administration handled the Arab Spring. And I was talking about it from the Senate floor, trying to get a vote on the notion, let's just take Libya, because this is where we really got off the tracks, I think. This administration established the notion that a president can unilaterally use military force anywhere in the world on the basis of what they call humanitarian intervention, whatever that means. In a situation in Libya, and there's been some pretty good reporting on this, studies on this in the aftermath. What I was trying to say from the Senate floor and in the hearings was there were no treaty obligations for us to go into Libya. There were no Americans under attack or under risk of attack. And by the way, I used to say this with the State Department witnesses, do we have diplomatic relations with the Gaddafi government? Yes, we do. Then what are we doing bombing a country that we have diplomatic relations with? What is going on here? What is the national interest? Can you clearly say it? And the end result was predictable. The release of tribalism in Libya, the loss of accountability of thousands of weapons that were in Gaddafi's arsenals. One of the estimates from a Harvard study, I think, said it was like there are 2,500 man-pads, anti-aircraft weapon systems that are unaccounted for from Libya, just from Libya. So we did two things there in a space of time that brought more chaos to this region. It's almost like a scientific principle of chaos. You couldn't make it any worse. And then the situation with ISIS actually mirrors a little bit what was happening when my son was in Iraq in 06, 07. He was in the Ramadi area, and the Sunni populations got sick of al-Qaeda Iraq. Remember, al-Qaeda was not in Iraq when we invaded. They came in after we invaded to take advantage of all this sectarian violence, and they played their hand too strongly with the Sunnis. I can remember getting an email from my son when he was over there about when the Sunnis finally got sick of the al-Qaeda people, and they started lopping heads off. ISIS is, in my view, when you look in Iraq, a similar situation where they've moved in, they're taking advantage of the unrest among the Sunni population. And you got to be very careful how you handle that in terms of what we do militarily. You can look at Syria right now. Look at just read the news of the past couple of days with Turkey's relationship with the different Kurdish factions that goes back a long way, and the different quote anti-Assad, anti-whatever you want to call them, factions among the Sunnis. They're fluid. The people who align with them are fluid. So we wanted to take out Assad, and now they want the same people to take out ISIS, and this is the region. This is the region. So the answer for us should be to very carefully define what our national interest is when we use military force. And what I have said with respect to this particular issue is our national interest, our clear national interest, is international terrorism. If there are elements of this entity that are going to threaten us, we have the right under the United Nations Charter, the right of self-defense, to defend ourselves against them. But you got to be really careful in terms of the way, we have to be really careful in terms of the way that we are using military force in that part of the world. Yes, sir. And I'll get to you next since your hand's been up. Yeah.
One of your themes has constantly been duty to country and service. As you know, right now we have a volunteer military, and some of these folks, male and female, have been deployed 5, 6, 7, 8 times. I hear that less than 1% of the American population now serves in the military. My question is, do you think it's time to consider a national service? It doesn't have to be the military, but that would be one component, where probably young people, but maybe even, not necessarily 18, but up to early 20s, people would have some obligation to serve in some capacity to their country for a year, probably not practical, but perhaps 2+, and with military special benefits and so on. So that's my question.
I thank you for that question. I've always believed that the value of military service is when people have been able to, people from all different parts of the country, geographically, culturally, and otherwise, learn that they can work together and for a common good. And the Vietnam War too, despite the protests and that sort of thing. A lot of people forget that during Vietnam, 2/3 of the people who served were volunteers. 2/3 of the people who served in World War II were drafted. And 73% of the people who died in Vietnam were volunteers. But whether you're drafted or you're a volunteer, when you are put into this environment where you have to work together and you can't say I quit or I'm going to go get another job or whatever, you learn valuable things about yourself and about your country. The two hesitations about national service are, one, with respect to the military, it's so much smaller now in size than it was when we had the Cold War obligations. And the other is the compulsory nature of it. I think I've thought many times that if there were a way to incentivize people, and there are things I've been thinking about, quite frankly, and how you might incentivize people to come in and not only serve in the military, but what are we going to do with this country? I made this speech at the National Press Club in September, and I started talking about the American dream and what my dad had said to me, and I said, I'll give you 2 examples. If you're a 10-year-old kid living in East Baltimore, and going to the bathroom in a bucket because the landlord hadn't fixed your toilet, and the only people you see making money on the street is somebody down there selling drugs, your view of the American dream is a little different. Or if you're a kid in Clay County, Kentucky, we talk about the Appalachian Mountain areas, which Clay County, Kentucky is the poorest county in America, and it's 98% white. And you look around you and you see joblessness and drug use and where's your future going to be? And you have to leave. You have to leave in order to try to fight your way into, some other place where they've had better schooling. These are realities. So if we could find a way to, maybe through student loan forgiveness, maybe through a lot of different incentivized ways, if we could find a way to get people to come together and help solve those kinds of problems in our country. I introduced a bill, it didn't pass. We never got a vote on it, unfortunately. But I introduced a bill I called the Second Chance Act when I was in the Senate. Worked a long time on this legislation. And the idea of this bill kind of fits in to what we're talking about here, because if you look at our country today, only about 75% of the kids finish high school. And that was the same percentage when I was a kid. It's not that different. But with the high-tech society and these sorts of things, okay, you're 16, 17 years old, and you get pregnant, or you get an attitude, and you say, I'm not going to work for you, I quit. And then now you're 30 years old, and you got a couple kids, and you're not competitive. And what do? You just say, okay, my life's over. You know, I'm going to be down here forever. I believe in these pre-K programs people are talking about for young kids, but I think we ought to have a way to allow people who are like 30 and have that kid in pre-K to get educated. Yeah, second chance. Get them on the ramp, get them on the up ramp, and I think it would be surprising if that program were done energetically. How many people would do that? It's a long answer, but it's a good question.
Real quick, on a lighter note, did you see Joe Scarborough this morning? Morning, Joe?
No, I did not.
Well,
I usually do.
They had national polls for the 2016 election. And the good news is, since last week, your name recognition and your standing in the polls has jumped 50%.
Is that right?
Yeah, but you might not want to ask me what. Go ahead. It was 2, and now it's 3. All right. But that's 50%. So my question is, I guess, will we be seeing more of you in New Hampshire over the next couple of years, perhaps?
Well, let me just say, I'm not surprised by that. I mean, not the numbers. I'm not surprised by it.
More than it was.
I did something else when I left the Senate that a lot of people wondered why I did it, but I decided that for a year I would do no media, no speeches, no op-eds, nothing, and I turned down all the shows. I wanted to get some distance, just write this book and rethink about things. So, considering the fact that I've only been out talking since June, I'm glad that Scarborough even mentioned my name. Yes, sir. You had your hand up.
Oh, okay. This is sort of a variation on the most recent question. Some people think that the trajectory of the Vietnam War was changed in part as the sons of the rich and powerful participated in the war. Some people also think that more recently, with the all-volunteer force, has impacted the willingness of our leaders to engage the military as a solution. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, Vietnam was a war that divided our generation, and quite often divided it along class lines. It's demonstrable. I think what you're talking about, which has some truth to it, is that when the draft lottery went into place, there are a lot of people who were, more vulnerable to having to serve, and I imagine it might have had an impact. I don't know for sure. The truth right now, and I've said it when I was in the Congress, in the Senate, is if you have to wake up every morning and wonder if your kid's alive, it will definitely cause you to think about things in a different way. Hmm? Yes, sir.
Tim, I just finished your book, and I appreciate your book. And going through the periods on Vietnam again, I've been thinking, I've read some of your essays on the pivot to Asia. And in my mind, I'm wondering, is it possible to sustain a real challenge from the East? How will Americans feel about it? Will they go along with it if it challenges our interests? Can we do that as we would in Europe? Because so many of us are European-based. How do we feel about that?
Well, first, with respect to the so-called pivot to Asia, I'm very proud of the fact that we actually began that out of my office when I came to the Senate 2 years before Barack Obama was elected. I've spent a lot of my life in East and Southeast Asia, and as a journalist, as a filmmaker, in government, in the military, et cetera. And when I came to the Senate, I got my staff together, and I said, our strategic axis in East Asia is through strengthening our relations with Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, and change the formula in Burma. And that's what we worked on every day. I used to take 3 to 4 trips a year into that region, you know, go on regular commercial. I think one of these, like, 12-day trips going to 5 countries, in and out, 25 airport entrances and exits in 12 days. So I feel very strongly that our connection to East Asia is vital to our commercial and security future. And one of the things that we worked on from our office was the notion that we need workable coalitions in that part of the world, with China expanding the way that it is and militarily the way that it is. China has laid out sovereignty claims in the South China Sea and near Japan that has been very patiently pushing. You know, push, take a step back, push, take a step back. And if they're looking 20 to 30 years in the future, it's very serious stuff. In 2012, in the Paracel Islands, which Vietnam claims, and I think if you look at their claims, they're pretty legitimate historical claims. China's also claimed the Paracels. They set up a prefecture based in the Paracel Islands, which is right off the coast of Vietnam, where they now claim a Chinese prefecture called Sansha, which covers 2 million square kilometers of the South China Sea and all of the riches underneath it, and the message that sends to the rest of the region. And I introduced a resolution which passed the Senate, basically condemning the use of military force in any of these sovereignty issues and calling for collective process of resolution. Because what China does is they say, no, we're going to only talk to one country at a time. And they obviously dominate every other country in the region, so they're not listening to anybody. But the stability to that part of the world, or the great lanes of commerce that go, you know, through the Strait of Malacca and up there to Korea, Japan, China, and soon Vietnam in a much larger way. I mean, that's a huge part of our economic and security future.
Senator, we have one more question.
Well, you're going to have to pick the last one. Okay. Yes, sir. You did have your hand up.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to second and thank you for your service, your family tradition of service as well, both military and in government. Very proud to say our son is a United States Marine. It's a glorious thing. I've not read your new book. I'm looking forward to it. I've read some of your previous work. And one of the things I read was an article you wrote many, many years ago about the role of women in the military. And you've taken some kind of low-key flack for that over your career. I wonder how you feel sort of 35 years on about that issue. Well,
the issue was, in the article, was women in combat, not women in the military per se. And we've gone through an evolution, and I think a very healthy evolution. I wrote that article in 1979, I think it was, right after Fields of Fire had come out, and I'd been through a very tough war. We were living in an environment, a political environment, where the political process was constantly using the military as a social lab, and there was a lot of, harsh words going back and forth at that time. But when I became Secretary of the Navy in 1987, we opened up more billets to women than any Secretary of the Navy in history. But we did it the right way. I did not just say, okay, I'm Secretary of the Navy and this is what you're going to do. I brought in the Chief of Naval Operations and the 3 combatant commanders of submarines, air, and surface. And I said, I want to put together a study, a fair study, and I want them to report to you, and then you report to me. And we got 28 senior enlisted and mid-career officers, half male, half female. We sent them around the world, and they came back and they made a series of proposals. And I accepted these proposals from the military. In other words, that's how the system is supposed to work. You report to me, and I will, I will think about it, but I will back you up. And so we did it in a way that I think helped maintain the disciplinary order as the military went through transition. We went through a similar process on Don't Ask, Don't Tell when I was chairman of the personnel subcommittee in the Senate, where there were people who just wanted to change that. I said, we have to listen to the military. We have to hear from the military. We got a study done, anonymous study of people in the military, and we were able to gauge what the feelings were on it. We listened to the commanders, and then the decision was made. So those are the ways, the best ways to incorporate society, changes that have occurred in our society into our military structure. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
We'd now like to present the senator with this gift. Thank you for your time.
Okay.
And there will be a book signing right over here.
I think I'll open this up in private. Thank you.